Hi, everyone, and welcome to my lecture on intellectual virtue. This lecture will not simply repeat what you learned during Task 2 of Unit 1 when you were first introduced to the concept of intellectual virtue via SoftChalk module. I will be elaborating on and deepening your understanding of the concept. So remember that the triangle is used to emphasize in a visual way that I'm about to focus on the most important concept or a very important fundamental and powerful concept in a lecture or lesson. And so here, of course, you can see that I'm using the triangle to name the concept intellectual virtue. So right now I'm just going to focus on intellectual virtue generally. So a definition that I want you to remember throughout the semester for intellectual virtue is that of a character trait of good thinkers and learners. In other words, of good thinkers and good learners, but also in many instances where thinking and learning is a vital aspect of communication, intellectual virtue can also be understood as referring to character traits that are conducive to being good communicators as well. So with that said, I want to emphasize that this definition has really important words and that this is really a very crude version of a definition that you got during on the first slide that started talking about intellectual virtue generally in the SoftChalk module from Task 2 of Unit 1. But character is an important word, trait, good, learners, and thinkers. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words that name fundamental and powerful concepts within the definition for our main concept for this particular lecture, intellectual virtue, or named by intellectual virtue. And one thing I want to remind you guys is that, and I don't know if you really caught on to this during Unit 1, but often when people think about character, they think about it in terms of morality and making decisions and taking actions that have to do with, how we think about moral, right and wrong, or in terms of like behavior or choices or decision making. But character has also to do with how we use our intellect, our feelings, our motivations, and our attitudes that have to do with our intellect and our status as beings who can know and believe things, learn things, think about things. So as you were first introduced to the intellectual virtue concept, you were told that it's a disposition that motivates one to seek and attain epistemic goods such as truth, rationality, understanding, and wisdom. And what I want you to understand is that this term here, epistemic goods, okay, is itself another important concept within the definition or explanation for intellectual virtue itself. And that what you have here in this list, starting with evidence all the way to wisdom, are examples of what philosophers might call epistemic goods. So keep that in mind. Intellectual virtue, because it does consist of a set of character traits that does consist of, dispositions and motivations, will influence or do influence one's attitudes and or feelings, emotions about the pursuit, attainment, and sharing or transmission of epistemic goods. So in other words, our ability to reflect certain dispositions will motivate us to, in some kind of way, to pursue, attain, transmit, and share evidence, truth, rationality, understanding, and wisdom. So it's sometimes when we're thinking about and being mindful of intellectual virtue, it really sometimes is more focused on the self as a knower and a believer, a thinker and a communicator, one's own pursuit and attainment of, evidence, truth, rationality, understanding, wisdom. But there's also at times when intellectual virtue has a social or other dimension to it. That is, maybe sometimes we're working on a group project or we're supposed to create an epistemic product, a good, a PowerPoint that shares or conveys knowledge or tries to transmit knowledge to others, to like maybe when you have to do a class presentation, or when maybe we're sharing viewpoints or responding to each other's views. So that can be a social dimension of intellectual virtue. And so intellectual virtue actually does influence our actions and behaviors, because our actions and behaviors, when it comes to a context of thinking, learning, and communicating, is a direct outcome of our feelings, our attitudes about, various epistemic goods, which is, of course, connected to what motivates us or it may be even having a certain lack of the right motivation to pursue these academic goods, to attain them, to share them, to transmit epistemic goods in a maximal way. So as you will recall, you were introduced to 4 intellectual virtues, and during Unit 2 for this particular lecture video, I will be focusing on one particular intellectual virtue. But can we just briefly name the intellectual virtues that you were introduced to that is beyond intellectual humility? You might want to pause the video now and see if you can try to remember the names of the 3 other intellectual virtues that you were introduced to during Unit 1. So, did you remember the term intellectual courage? What about intellectual empathy? And then the last one that you were introduced to was intellectual perseverance.